Hey everybody, Sarah here. So today we are going to be continuing our series on the introduction to corn snake morphs. For those of you who don't know, I am a corn snake breeder. I've been doing this for over 13 years. This has been my passion ever since I can really remember. And I have pretty much dedicated my life to educating people on corn snake things, mostly morphs. So if you are interested in something like that, please continue watching. In the last video that I did on this series, we went over A's and B's, so things like amelanistic as well as things like buff, and we also went over some extra things. So buff is very similar to toffee, so we also talked about toffee, and of course like anerythristic is also similar to charcoal, so we also talked about charcoal. So we knocked out a few C's already, but we're going to continue with the rest of the C's because trust me, there are many. Before I jump in, I just want to thank all the members on this channel who are helping to make everything possible. You guys really help keep me going. For those of you who don't know what memberships are, it's very similar to like a Patreon. You just don't have to go to a different website to do it. You just do it straight through YouTube. And that money is helping to support everything we do on this channel, including book reviews. I put all of the money into the channel that you guys put into the channel, so I don't keep it. It goes straight back to content for you. So if anybody else would like to become a member, it's $2 a month right now, and I will be adding a new tier soon, but we're just not quite there yet. You can click join under any video if you would like to be a member. A quick thank you to reptilinks.com also for helping to support this channel. If you would like to try this alternative food source for your snakes, it's whole ground prey in a collagen casing. I prefer to use the quail rabbit mix for my snakes. I think that it kind of gives the best of all worlds for them. They get the extra calcium and it helps with boosting snakes that have been laying eggs or getting ready to breed. So since breeding season is coming up, that might be a really good idea for some aspiring breeders or breeders who are having trouble getting their females to bounce back after laying eggs. I also have a website, sarahsnakeshop.com, where I sell corn snakes and corn snake accessories. If you would like corn snake morph books, I have written 2 books, and they are written for the beginner in mind. So if you are really interested in learning the basics of corn snake morphs, I, of course, would highly recommend getting those books. With all that said, let's get into the video. The mutations that we are going to be going over today are caramel, cherry, and cinder. Now, for those of you wondering why not Christmas and why not charcoal? For one, charcoal I already did in the previous video if you would like to go watch that, and Christmas will be covered later on when we talk about hypomelanistic mutations, but I don't want to jump into hypomelanistic mutations just yet. It seems like these 3 are going to be the perfect number to cover for this video. Starting out with the caramel mutation. Caramels pretty much just have an excess of yellow, and they also don't really have any reds. And when they hatch out, they're pretty much just brown on white or brown on tan. A lot of people confuse them for being normals when they're babies, or maybe aneries. A normal as a baby will have a sort of reddish brown color on tan, and an anery, of course, is just black and white. And so it's kind of a mix between these two as babies. As they grow, though, they gain more and more yellow. Yellow is typically the last color to develop in a corn snake, and so it takes a lot longer for a caramel's color to come out compared to some of the other mutations that we see, such as normal or anery. Caramels can look very different depending on what the locality that they came from is. We'll talk about locality in another video. In fact, I have done a video on different localities in the past if you would like to check that out. But basically what that means is that sometimes they will have a very silvery background instead of tan if they're maybe from a Miami background. And sometimes they will also have a very bright golden background. So they can vary a lot in their coloration, but for the most part what we're looking for is no reds at all. The only pigments you're going to see are yellow pigment and black pigment on a caramel. Their eyes are also going to be a telltale sign of what morph they are. As babies, these eyes can be kind of a hazel color, and as adults, their eyes are usually a very yellowish golden color. Speaking of golden, there is one other mutation that looks very similar to caramel, that it's an old mutation, but there's not very many of them, and that is called golden. Golden does the same thing that caramel does. It removes the reds and enhances the yellows. Golden is probably the rarest mutation that's out there right now, so you're not just going to find one for sale willy-nilly, but I thought I would at least mention that there are multiple mutations that do the same thing, once again, in the sort of caramel-looking mutations. If you watched my last video, you remember that there were two anerythristic mutations, anery A and anery B also being called charcoal. And so we have something similar going on here with the caramel and the golden. It's just two different mutations that do the exact same thing. If you breed a caramel to a golden, you will just get normals. They are not going to be compatible. And I understand that the genetics are a little bit weird. I'm not going to go over genetics and recessive and all that here since this is an introduction video, but I do have videos on that if you would like to go back and look at them. Now, if you'll remember in the last video, we went over different terms that we use in the corn snake hobby, such as amelanistic and hypomelanistic. Amelanistic is another term that we use for the typical albino. We don't use the word albino because the word albino just means removing of a pigment. And since there are multiple different pigments in corn snakes, we have two different types of yellow. We have red and we also have black. Removing any one of those is considered an albino type. And so technically, caramel is sort of considered an albino type because it removes all of that reds. Now it does keep all of the yellows and it also enhances the yellow, so it's a hyperxanthic and anerythristic at the same time. In the last video we talked about the typical anerythristic types A and B, and those were mostly just black and white or gray on gray, and there were very few yellow tones and no red tones at all. However, there are some that retain a lot of these yellows, and that is what caramel does, and that is also what golden does. So if you're wondering about these terms, feel free to go back and look at the previous video. I know I've said that a few different times, but that really is going to be one of the best introduction videos. I will mention here just the general breakdown of what all the terms mean. So if there's an A before the term or an AN before the term, that means that there's a lacking completely. There's none of it. So amelanistic means completely removing the melanin. Anerythristic means completely removing the red pigment. And the hypo actually means reduction of, but not complete removal of something. So it's just less than usual. I use the comparison of like the medical term hypoglycemia for this because it basically means less than you should have or less than usual. So hypomelanism or hypoerythrism is just a reduction of a certain pigment. And hyper is in excess of. So we can also say that caramel is likely a hyperxanthic mutation since xanthan is the yellow pigment. The next mutation that I want to talk about is called cherry, and cherry is one that is really, really uncommon, another one that you're probably not just going to find in most places. However, it is a morph that enhances the red. It is a hypererythristic mutation. We also would call this a red factor mutation. There are a lot of different kinds of red factor, but cherry is one of them. There's another one that we call coral as well, and they are technically different. So coral has its own sort of place in everything, but it pretty much does the same thing. Cherry also tends to remove a lot of the yellows. There's not going to be a lot of yellow in cherries. So I know that there's a lot of these morphs that really look the same, and it can be very confusing, so I will try to break it down for you guys as best I can. Cherry and coral are both hypererythristic mutations, which means they both enhance the reds and the pinks in the snake's coloring. They are different even though they look very similar. It also seems that cherry is axanthic, which we talk about A in the beginning of a word, meaning completely taking away, and xanthan is the yellow pigment. There are multiple yellow pigments. I mentioned this before. There's a carotenoid yellow as well that most people say the snake will get from its food, and this will show up in the cheeks and sometimes in the sides of the snake's body. I have noticed that some lines do have a higher amount of this than other lines. lines do, but I'm not going to get into that. That's a lot more detailed than I want to get into in this video. Xanthan is the main yellow pigment that's going to show up in the main part of the snake's body, and the cherry mutation pretty much removes all of that. You're really not going to see any xanthan yellow coming in through a cherry. However, corals do have some of that yellow. They will retain some of that yellow. That is one visual difference between the two. However, like I said, different lines have different amounts of yellow in them. So if you are looking for something that's really, really bright pink or bright red, it's definitely nice to look for something that is coral or cherry. But take a look at the parents. If you're asking a breeder, see if the breeder can send you photos of the parents so you get an idea of what the babies are going to look like. If you are wanting something that's bright red with absolutely no yellows, the parents are going to be the best indicator of what they're going to look like when they grow up. As babies, both cherries and corals will be a much brighter red than a typical normal will be. And of course, as they grow, they just have a higher intensity of reds throughout their body compared to just a normal. The last morph that I want to talk about today is called the Cinder mutation, which used to be called the Ashy mutation, but over time the word Cinder really stuck and Ashy didn't really stick, so Cinder is what we call it today. Cinder at first glance looks like an anerythristic mutation, but once we mix it with something like amelanistic, it's really obvious that the reds stay. In fact, when you mix Cinder with amelanistic, the morph combination is called peppermint because it retains that bright red in the saddles. So we know that it's not anerythristic. However, it might be sort of a hypoerythristic. And these also do not have a whole lot of yellow, so we're thinking there's also some axanthic going on as well. So the pigments that we know remain is a limited amount of red, as well as obviously the melanin is pretty typical throughout the snake's body. As babies, cinders will look a lot like aneries. There's hardly a difference in them as babies. Sometimes they will have a more powder purple color to their saddles as babies, and even as they grow, sometimes it is hard to see that red in the saddles because it is so muted, and the melanin almost tends to cover it up. And so when you kind of mix this dark gray on top of a sort of faded red color, you get this weird powder purple color. One of the biggest differences that we see with Cinder versus a normal is there's a little bit of a pattern difference. A lot of times cinders will have an odd belly pattern where there's kind of a split down the middle. Sometimes they'll have a strange head pattern, and they usually have more saddles, like saddle-shaped blotches over their body than a normal on average. This is partially because the pattern sort of gets condensed because of what this mutation does, and so it kind of adds room for extra pattern to happen. They also have a lot of speckles throughout their body and throughout their pattern. If you look really close up at the scales, and sometimes even in the irises of the eyes, they will have sort of darker speckles throughout their lighter coloring, and that's just not something that you see in a lot of non-cinder morphs. So if you have two snakes that look similar and you think one of them might be a cinder, this speckling could be your indication that you do. So just a quick recap, we talked about caramel and that it is reducing all of the reds, in fact taking all of the reds away and enhancing those yellows more so than the average corn snake will have. And a similar mutation to that being golden, which does essentially the same thing. We talked about cherry, which enhances the reds, and it pretty much takes away all of the main yellows on the snake, and its sort of sister mutation known as coral. Coral keeping some of those yellows, and so there's a little bit of a difference there. Coral also doesn't seem to enhance the reds quite as much, but coral is very, very common. And then of course we talked about Cinder, which is not quite an anerythristic mutation, but kind of an axanthic mutation along with a hypoerythristic mutation. It sounds very strange, but I'm hoping that you guys understanding these terms will help you understand corn snake morphs and what they actually do, so that if you ever want to research morphs, you will sort of know, like, okay, if I mix an amelanistic and an anerythristic, what am I going to get? Well, you're taking away all of the melanin, and then you're taking away these other colors, and so if you mix that together, what the product is pretty much just white, and that's what we call a snow. So I'm hoping that by you guys learning exactly what all of these morphs do, if you are doing any research or if you intend to become breeders in the future, you will know what you are going to get if you try to combine any of these things. And I'm also giving you sort of the layman's terms as well as the more scientific terms, so that when you come across these terms in the future, you will know what they're talking about. Like, oh, I know that the A at the beginning of this word means that there's none of it, and when I see the word xanthan after that, then I know that that means yellow pigment, so that means that this snake is not going to have any yellow pigment. So I'm really hoping that that helps you guys kind of understand breaking everything down. And if there's any pointers or anything specific that you guys would like to know, please let me know in the comments any question you might have, because any question that you have could be a question that someone else has as well. So you could be helping the entire community just by asking that one question. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in a new video soon. Please subscribe.